English translation 630th contact. Sunday, the 11th of October 2015, 8:26 hours.
Hello, Edward, my friend. Since you are now getting out of bed sometime earlier than before your operation, I will also come to the early hour and want to check on your condition.
You see me surprised, my son, because I have not yet expected you, because Florina told me yesterday that you will not come until next week.
Florina must have misunderstood me when I told her last Friday that I was coming to visit in a few days, thinking of 2 or 3 days.
Not bad, and misunderstandings are just here and there. But be welcomed and greeted, my good friend. And if you don't mind, I'd like to clarify something that caused some confusion during the last General Assembly on the 2nd of October. It was a matter of translating articles, brochures, and small writings, except books, which are translated worldwide into other languages by all FIGU groups as well as by interested private persons, etc., and which are then allowed to be put on the internet by these groups, for which we are then allowed to set a link from the Mother Center for the individual foreign translations. And exactly with the link, the whole thing was not clear, because by it the group members understood and understand what I already predicted during our private conversation, that a direct connection and linkage with the strange web pages, etc. is meant, to which you told me privately, however, that this is not meant in such a way, but evenly that only an address reference is to be given in relation to a concerning group or person who has switched on a translation of a writing in the applicable national language on the own web page.
Another misunderstanding, which is unfortunate. Florina told me about it, so I tried our linguists committee to define the English term link according to her understanding. Our scientists therefore understand the term link to mean that something is connected or linked to each other. Just as on the other hand, it also means that a link can be used to give a useful hint or tip to something, an address, information, or a person. It is clear to me that a link in today's World Wide Web or Internet corresponds to a characteristic feature and represents a fundamental element, whereby the link corresponds to a network or connection or a simple piece of information, but also simply to a hint that is not classified as a network or connection. A link can be used to connect web pages and other files with each other, whereby this is located on the same computer, but can also be made available to other files by a web server, or can only be used as a simple hint. So the link also serves to pass on information without a connection or connection to other data carriers, because only a reference is given with regard to a thing, information, or person, etc. A link can refer to another file, to another web page, or to any address or thing, such as an audio, image, video file, or web page, etc., but also in the form of a reference to a dynamically created document, map, mailing address, or a specific information or person. Each link, therefore, always contains a certain destination or an mailing address, whereby a link or connection with another file or website does not necessarily have to take place, but simply a reference can be given in a neutral manner in relation to a certain mailing address, information, or person, which states, for example, that an addressed important information is shown and made available on an external website, etc.
I find the explanation good and understandable, but for our purposes I would like to write something about it and add that we refuse any responsibility for incorrect translations if we refer to translation pages in other languages with links from now on.
We have also thought about this in the committee, which is why we have prepared the following draft, which you should use as a disclaimer form. Of course, you can also create your own design, but this should correspond to the content and value of our design. We have created our references or links to external translations on the Internet in such a way that the following applies comprehensively to all our references or links. The FIGU has no influence on the external translation pages in relation to FIGU articles and FIGU writings, to which we refer on our homepage, Therefore, we dissociate ourselves hereby also expressly regarding the correctness of all external translation contents, whereby we do not make ourselves the external contents of the translations also not own. This declaration applies to all translations of Figu articles and fonts shown on our homepage through references or links, as well as to all other external contents of the pages to which our references and links lead.
I think it is good, so we will talk about it at the next General Assembly and make a decision. Now I have a question, which refers to an article part from Saturday, the 22nd of August 2015, in the newspaper Tages Anzeiger, and where a Dr. Franz Immer says the following.
They can lose their lives in the most incredible situations, drown in a puddle, fall while skiing, suffocate in a hole. However, most organ donors die from severe cerebral hemorrhage. The typical donor is 52 years old. He wakes up with a severe headache. His wife sends him to the family doctor, but he does not leave and collapses at the coffee machine. He's brain dead in the afternoon.
My question now, is what the man says true so far? More than a yes or no, I do not want to know.
Yes, in some cases that's true.
Thank you, it's more than a yes, but it's settled. Then I would like to know what force actually makes it possible to protect an aircraft on a planet against planetary magnetism, and thus produce a repulsive effect, which we call an anti-gravity effect, but which, judged physically, is probably not correct. The whole thing is a factor of electromagnetism, if I have correctly understood all that you have explained to me in various ways. Every object and everything, a planet or a flying machine, that is to say everything that has its own natural or artificial electromagnetism, has its own magnetosphere, which means that on the one hand an attraction force and on the other hand also a repulsion force is given, whereby the latter is called Lorentz force in our physics. Is this force decisive for the fact that you can accelerate your aircrafts in earthly atmosphere with very high speeds? Because the Lorentz force works against Earth magnetism, or rather puts it out of action in relation to your aircrafts, so to speak.
That is correct, but I am not allowed to give further details, because it is forbidden by our directives.
But may, and can you say something with regard to the function of the Lorentz force, which you call different, but which equally means what we Earthlings understand to be the Lorentz force?
I can give you an explanation. The Lorentz force is the force that occurs in a moving charge in a magnetic or electric field, or the force that a magnetic field exerts on a moving charge. The Lorentz force is the force that acts on individual moving charge carriers in a magnetic field. Earth also has such a magnetic field, the magnetism of which affects the entire planet and far beyond, in a form similar to that of moving. Earth magnetism can be understood as a separate body that magnetically influences other bodies in its near and far surroundings. To put it another way, it means that Earth magnetism exerts forces on everything that falls within its range. This is in contrast to a normal magnet which only reacts to ferromagnetic substances such as iron, cobalt, or nickel, and corresponds to an artificial product. Earth magnetism is created in the innermost core of Earth by rotation, heat, and cold, whereby rapidly changing metal crystals are formed and generate magnetic waves that oscillate through the whole Earth and into the near-world space and are attractive.
That's enough, thank you, because it doesn't have to be a seminar. Well, some time ago you explained to me that somewhere in South Africa there was a cave in which there were still many bones of an ancient human race unknown on Earth. Achim Wolf from Germany has now sent me a newspaper article in which he talks about this cave and the bones, so I have searched through the last contact reports, but found nothing of our conversation.
You could not find anything either, because we had a private conversation about this matter, after the 614th official conversation on Monday, the 23rd of February of this year.
Then I was wrong, because I really thought that we had officially talked about it, and only recently.
That's right, but it was another time in a private way.
Too bad, because it would have been a good hint for the article Occam sent.
Do you still have the article?
Yes, in the computer. Look here one moment. Yes, there he is, and you can read it.
Thanks.
Ta reads the article.
Homo naledi. Researchers discover new human species Homo naledi, a new species of the genus Homo from the Dinaledi Chamber, South Africa.
DPA, National Geographic, Mark Thiessen.
In a cave in South Africa, researchers have discovered thousands of bones of a hitherto unknown human species. The graceful creature was apparently good on foot. Like modern man, it cultivated a burial rite. They call the extinct relative of modern man Homo naledi. In a cave in South Africa, researchers have discovered bones of a hitherto unknown human species. How old the relics of at least 15 individuals are has not yet been clarified, writes an international research team in 2 studies in the journal eLife. The remains of the species are part of an extensive discovery of fossils made by researchers at the South African University of the Witwatersrand in 2013. More than 1,550 parts of it have been recovered so far. It is unclear how many are still lying in the cave, said a spokeswoman of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, which is also involved in the research. According to the researchers, this is the largest fossil find of human remains on the African continent to date. The fossils lie in a secluded chamber of the cave, which was only accessible via a very narrow channel. Orange-sized brain. Almost all of Homo naledi's bones were found several times in the chamber, reports team leader Lee Berger from the University of the Witwatersrand. Therefore, he is already better known to science than all other fossil representatives of the human lineage. Homo naledi was about 1.50 meters tall and weighed 45 kilograms. The researchers attest him a very graceful physique and a brain only about the size of an orange. Homo naledi's skull, teeth and pelvis did resemble the earliest representatives of our type like Homo habilis. The shoulders resembled those of apes. In other points, however, the researchers saw modern properties. The feet, for example, can hardly be distinguished from those of a modern person. With his hands, he was probably clever enough to use tools. The comparatively strongly bent fingers also indicated that Homo naledi was able to climb, explains paleoanthropologist Tracy Kivel from the Max Planck Institute. Because of the location, the researchers assumed that the dead were deliberately discarded. The fact that the deceased are buried was previously regarded as a ritual of modern man, Homo sapiens. The bones show no traces of scavengers and predators. According to the scientists, there is nothing to suggest that animals or natural processes, such as running water, may have transported the dead into the chamber. The few non-human fossil parts there, the 3 originate from mice and birds that accidentally enter the chamber. Such a situation is unique in the fossil report of man, says researcher John Hawkes from the University of Wisconsin in the USA. Team leader Lee Berger explained that the researchers had gone through numerous scenarios, for example a mass death, an unknown predator, or an accidental death in a death trap. After all possibilities had been excluded, only the deliberate removal of the dead had remained as the most plausible variant. There are also doubts the name of the new species is a homage to the place where it was found. The cave is called Rising Star, and Naledi means star in the South African regional language Sesotho. But there are also doubts about the discoverer's interpretation. The bones could well come from several species. Jeffrey Schwartz, evolutionary biologist at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, told Nature magazine. However, he left open how the bones of two human species could have reached the same cave. However, team leader Berger explained that the combination of the anatomical properties of Homo naledi distinguishes him from all previously known human species. There are still hundreds, if not thousands, of remains of Homo naledi in the South African caves. JPL/NASA.
Yes, this is exactly what we've been talking about twice. The statements related to the hole are interesting, also with regard to the fact that in South Africa similar finds are to be expected in further caves, because this is indeed true.
If you say so, then so will it be. What still interests me today, however, is the explanation given to me by Asket in 1961 about the former Turkish president Adnan Menderes, whom I got to know through her help. Also what she predicted with regard to the Kurdish PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan, as well as her predictions for the present time with regard to the streams of refugees and the Islamist State, would be interesting to hear again. At that time I was with the girl on the Turkish island Imrali in the Sea of Marmara, which lies about 50 kilometers southwest of Istanbul and is only about 0.05 km² in size and has not been inhabited since 1995. This island used to belong to Greece, to my knowledge, until 1935, but from that year it belongs to Turkey, whose military and state authorities immediately converted it into a prison island. So a prison or penitentiary was built on it, which became one of the safest prisons and detention centers in Turkey. On the 17th of September, 1961, Asket brought me to this prison island for about 3 hours because she wanted me to see how brutally the Earthlings treated, executed, and murdered people in the name of the law. We both wore protective suits, just as we did with the pyramids of Giza, which made us invisible to all the military and politicians, etc. present, who were probably witnesses to the execution. So I experienced there just as a person was murdered by the state, as on the 25th of May 1944 at Katzensee near Regensdorf, when my godfather, he was a prisoner in the prison, led me to the execution site of Hans Grobli, where we witnessed the execution in a hidden way. The shooting site was then called Grobli Gruebli by the people, as Bernadette found out on the internet. At the Imrali prison on the island, where there were always about 200 to 300 prisoners, as Asket explained, it was the former Turkish president of Turkey, Adnan Menderes, who was executed or hanged. As with the military traitor institution at the Katzensee, this event also remained indelibly in my memory. I have also not forgotten the fact that Menderes was dressed in a white robe, and a poster with the Revolution Tribunal's verdict on it was attached to his clothes. So everything remained in my memory to this day, as well as the fact that he was not hanged from an effective gallows, but from a tripod about 4 meters high standing on the prison grounds. After hanging from his neck, he was knotted to one of the tripods and photographed. It was a heavy tripod consisting of 3 interconnected beams in the middle of the top, partly with lettering, thus forming a statically definite structure that stood on the floor without tipping over. Asket, like your father Svath, have predicted, told and explained to me many things about events that even today still extend far into the distant future, to which I am obliged, however, to remain silent about certain facts, for various reasons. What interests me now is what Asket told me about Menderes, which is why I asked Florina to inform you of my wish, and ask you if you could bring me the records if they were in your possession.
That you know how to remain silent is not a question, and the records of the conversations and executions between you and Asket are actually in my possession, according to which I can recite them. Asket explained the following to you on the 17th of September 1961, when she took you to where the deposed President Adnan Menderes was hanged.
Explanations by Asket on the 17th of September 1961 on the prison island Imrali, Sea of Marmara, Turkey.
Your brief conversation with Adnan Menderes in his room, because I neutralized the guards, will inevitably cause you, as I know you, to ask me questions, especially about Menderes, the future of this island, and future political events. But I'm sure I already know your questions, so I can answer them without you pronouncing them first. Edouard Billy, you think right, girl, because I am interested in everything that is important in connection with Menderes, as well as everything that will result in the future with this island, Turkey and the neighboring countries, Syria, Iraq and Persia, but also with Europe, the USA, Asia, and the Soviet Union, etc. And I am particularly interested in this in military, political, religious, and economic terms. I thought so, so I will answer to you, but I must urge you to keep all the explanations for yourself, and not to speak openly about them, because these are direct predictions which must not be made public. So it will not be about negative prophecies that can be changed and prevented by corresponding actions, but about predictions that inevitably come true and cannot be impaired by thoughtless actions, etc., and cannot be invalidated by attempts of change. If this were to be attempted to the contrary, however, this would result in events which on the one hand would prevent everything that could be expected to be positive and change it into something negative, but on the other hand would increase and aggravate the negative factors expected to be negative by a great deal. But now we should focus our attention, even if I am now answering your questions on the procedure now, underway and move cautiously so that our presence is not noticed by a carelessness that we have caused. This could still happen if we move carelessly and come into physical contact with those present. Even if our camouflage does not allow us to be seen or heard outside of it, touches would still attract the attention of men. But now I have to say that on the one hand, I was very astonished how Adnan Menderes looked at us inquiring, without arousal and without any thought or emotion, when I opened the camouflage and we suddenly stood in front of him. Our appearance did not even frighten or astonish him, and when you approached him, he was also completely calm and answered your questions as if you had known each other for a long time. On the other hand, I also admire your behavior, how you spoke and dealt with the death candidate, and how you had a conversation with him through the language translator, which astonished me very much.
Of course! I will keep silent and only bring to the public those facts of your statements for which I can be held accountable. This is absolutely clear to me because I know exactly what can happen if something is said too much. But not only you, but also I was amused at Menderes, who in my opinion was able to control himself completely and was therefore in control so that he was able to take the situation as it just happened to be. And when I told him, as you heard, how and why we were in his room, and that you had stunned the guards, he took it for granted. But I think, as you yourself said, that we should now focus on what is going on, but you can still make your statements.
Of course, and now that we have enough time to talk to each other before the inevitable happens, I can still answer some of your unasked questions that I know without you having to tell me. In addition, I know what has happened to date, how I know a lot about what is going to happen in the future and what will happen in the future. On the one hand, as a result of my task here on the earth, I know the political conditions and events, including those which have arisen with regard to Menderes and which will arise and occur in the coming and more distant future in Turkey, Asia, Persia, Iraq, Syria, the Soviet Union, the USA, and Europe. So I know through contemplations and observations that I have made in future times what will also happen in Africa, Europe, Arabia, and Asia. Therefore, I can give you very exact dates and details that will happen in the near and distant future. Also with regard to yourself, whereby I want to remind you especially what will happen next year with you on the 4th of August, which you should not forget. But now I can explain to you that today, as well as decades later than in 1961, this island is the focus of international interest. But after the execution of Menderes, it will experience quieter times for nearly 4 decades, until 1999, before a man named Abdullah Öcalan will appear, who was born on the 4th of April 1949 in Ömerli, Şanlıurfa, Turkey, and who will be brought to this prison island, İmralı, in 1999 to be executed at a later time, but will not be carried out. The reason for the imprisonment of this man will be because he will be one of the leaders of a grouping of the so-called PKK organization, which will be formed in the 1970s from the grouping of the so-called Kurdistan revolutionaries. Before this, Abdullah Öcalan is brought to the island. The prisoners will be distributed to other Turkish prisons, where he will be the best guarded prisoner in Turkey on the island, which cannot be reached by land. The PKK organization, which from the 1970s will be classified as a Kurdish, Marxist-oriented underground organization originating in the Kurdish settlement areas within Turkey, will also fight politically in part in the neighboring countries of Syria, Persia and Iraq, and of course with armed force for political autonomy in Kurdish-populated areas, but mainly in Turkey, which will carry on well into the 3rd millennium. The hostilities will mainly be carried out with attacks on military and civilian targets, with the purpose of establishing an independent Kurdish state or a democratic autonomous Kurdistan within the existing state borders with its own non-state administrations. The future of the Kurdish population in its entirety will be extremely tragic because there will be many deaths in all countries involved in the fighting, especially in Turkey, and there will be no quick end and therefore also a large number of refugees from the Kurdish territories. The PKK organization will be classified as a terrorist organization by Turkey and by other states, especially by Europe, where a dictatorial European Union will be formed. Also, the USA will participate in the same way. And besides, the 41st President of the USA, George Herbert Walker Bush, will trigger a war in Iraq, which will last from 1990 to 1991. Afterwards, his son, George Walker Bush, as 43rd President of the USA, will provoke and accomplish in the year 2003 without official declaration of war, by lies and defamation like his father, another war in Iraq, after which the Iraqi state dictator Saddam Hussein will be condemned to death and hung according to American martial law. After that, an almost endless period of bloody terror will develop in the state of Iraq, which will exist well into the 3rd millennium. This is in addition to the fact that a murderous sectarian terrorist militia Billy, =Islamist State, will plunge Iraq into chaos, as will Syria, which will be shaken by a long-standing civil war. But back to Öcalan, who will be called Serok, or leader and chairman Abdullah Öcalan by the PKK organization. The consequence of all PKK machinations will be that he will be wanted and he will flee. On the 9th of September 1998, for example, he will flee his residence in Syria if Turkey threatens Syria with war. As a result, the man will try to obtain political asylum and support for a political solution in various countries such as Italy and Greece, etc., but this will be rejected. And this will also be the case in Europe, where in the 2nd decade of the new millennium against the new Russia, which will emerge from the Soviet Union dictatorial measures of the European Union, under the leadership of a naively ill German ruler named Merkel, the danger of another world war is conjured up. The new Russia, I must deviate somewhat from this in my statement and make it clear briefly that it will emerge from the old Soviet Union and will come about through political reforms. Political change at that time is called perestroika, which means reconstruction, transformation, and restructuring. In this way, the Great Reform will be described by a man named Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, who from the beginning of 1986 will initiate the reform process concerning the reconstruction and modernization of the social, political, and economic system of the Soviet Union. Until then, however, the United Party, CPSU, or Communist Party of the Soviet Union, will continue to predominate. The reform process will be closely linked to the lifting of restrictions on freedom of opinion and freedom of the press in the Soviet Union, which will take place under the slogan Glasnost Bili, openness, freedom of speech, freedom of information. At that time, the term referred to large sections of society and, in a broader sense, meant the democratization of the state from 1986 onwards. Perestroika was the first to include loosening of party directives with regard to the politics of the central administrative economy. This allowed companies to make their own decisions from 1987 onwards, which was a very important turning point in the era of socialism, when the first elements of a market economy were introduced. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev will be a Russian politician who will be General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from March 1985 to August 1991, and President of the Soviet Union from March 1990 to December 1991. But away from my declaration of deviation, it has to be further said that, with regard to the threatening events of the future, these will also be accompanied and connected with immense masses of refugees from African and Oriental countries, especially by the unreasonableness of the naive and power-obsessed rulers in Germany I have mentioned. However, I will not explain to you today, but at another time, the consequences of the masses of refugees which will spread throughout Europe. In this regard, however, I have already given you some information on various occasions, as Fat has already explained many things to you in detail, as well as you yourself have calculated facts and created several information articles about everything and sent them to governments, journals, newspapers, and radio stations as warnings regarding upcoming events. Now, however, I will confine myself to what is related to Adnan Menderes, who is being executed today, because there is no stopping the preparations in this regard, which is why I want to take the time to tell you the most important facts of the future, also with regard to Abdullah Öcalan, on which I will explain a few things in advance. But now I have to be brief because, as you can see, the last precautions are progressing. So I would like to mention briefly that Öcalan is also seeking asylum in Germany, where an international arrest warrant will be issued against him in 1990, following the murder of a dissident that will take place in Rüsselsheim in 1984. As a result of the order, the man was then arrested in Italy on the 12th of September on the basis of the German arrest warrant, but released again on the 16th of December 1998 after the federal government waived an extradition request due to feared protests by the Kurdish population. In January 1999, he fled Rome, carrying a forged Cypriot passport called Lazaros Mavros, which the Republic of Cyprus will refer to as Turkey's forgery for propaganda purposes. On the 15th of February 1999, after leaving the Greek embassy in Kenya, Turkey's Secret Service seized him and brought him to Turkey. In Turkey, he will be tried and sentenced to death for high treason, the formation of a terrorist organization, robbery, murder, and the use of explosives. In the new millennium, in 2002, the death sentence will be lifted and changed to life imprisonment. Although he will then be in prison, according to a new founding treaty, he will still be in charge of the leadership of the organization, which will then be called Komakivakan Kurdistan, or KCK, which in your language means Union of the Communities of Kurdistan, and which will embody a Kurdish underground organization. Their goal is to be the nucleus of a non-governmental society and the implementation of the democratic confederalism that Abdullah Öcalan will create on the 20th of March 2005. In June 2007, the original names Komakomelen Kurdistan and Kurdistan Democratic Confederalism will be changed to Komakivakan Kurdistan. But now to Ali Adnan Ertekin Menderes, who studied law in Ankara and graduated from Robert College in 1935. He was a son of a landowner named Ibrahim Ethem from Güzelhisar in the province of Aydin, and he was the first Prime Minister of Turkey to emerge from free elections and ruled from 1950, and was overthrown by the military on the 27th of May 1960 and sentenced to death by the tribunal in the Yasiada trials. He was born in 1899 in the district of Kocaeli in the Turkish province of Aydin, and is now, on the 17th of September 1961, murdered or executed on this prison island of İmralı by state arbitrariness. In 1936 he was a member of parliament. In 1945 he founded the Democratic Party, after which he became Prime Minister in 1950. And because he used his power to suppress the opposition dictatorially, he was overthrown in May 1960 by General Cemal Gürsel and sentenced to death. Menderes has always been widely feared and hated by his political opponents, who have long engaged in all sorts of hate speech, intrigues, and unfair machinations to drive him out of his position. They succeeded when he was overthrown on the 27th of May 1960, arrested and sentenced to death by hanging in the Yasiada trials, which lasted from the 14th of October 1960 to the 15th of September 1961. In these exceptional court trials, 19 criminal trials were conducted in which, after the military coup, not only Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, but also President Celal Bayar and close to 600 other former members of the government, members of the Turkish parliament, and civil servants of various offices were brought to justice, with the prosecution demanding 228 death sentences. And with regard to the death penalty, I have to say that it corresponds to a criminal arbitrariness, by which all applicable standards of all rights, laws and recommendations, as well as the interests and the inviolability of life and limb of man, are disregarded by maliciously abusing the legal power and the judgments, actions, decisions, and behavior associated with it. But exactly from this, and from all the earlier incidents around Menderes, it resulted that he is now executed or today murdered by a state arbitrary act, and that he was feared by the opposition during the whole time of his execution of office, and also after the conviction, will remain so until he will have done his last breath. As you can see for yourself, even now the new masters of Turkey do not dare to breathe freely, nor does the executioner, because they are all full of fear, although Menderes is completely defenseless in his present state. And as you saw earlier, the hangman trembled very much when he threw Menderes over the white dress of death and attached the poster with the death sentence of the Revolutionary Tribunal written on it. And what you do not know is the fact that as a result of the fear and cowardice of the new rulers, they have eliminated every risk so that the dissatisfied military could not intervene from outside and prevent the execution. So it was detached in time for a NATO maneuver and thus put out of action, while furthermore the police forces of the country were put on highest alert and the people were forbidden any discussion concerning the death sentence. And in the coming hours, only when the executioner reports the execution and the regime publicly announces the death of Adnan Menderes, will the officer regime, which has ruled since May 1960, feel liberated from its deepest fear and worst vengeance. And that is understandable, because Menderes was much more dangerous to the Kemalist revolutionaries during his incarceration than he was at the time when he was running his government business from his workroom. And as you can see right now, even if you can't hear him talking, Menderes is triumphing over the Puritan May revolutionaries just now under the gallows. You see, that is what happened. Let us get out of here.
End explanation quote.
That is Ascot's explanation of how she said everything to you on the 17th of September, 1961.
Thank you. Somehow her depressed voice still sounds in my ears today. At that time I tried to digest the whole thing, but then I got to the bottom of it. So I learned that after the deposition and arrest of Adnan Menderes, a provisional head of state named Gürsel was appointed, who trumpeted that the death sentence of the court against Menderes was a serious warning to all politicians who would dare to disregard the ideals of the Constitution. This revolutionary Papa Gürsel was also no more than a power-hungry despot, to whom a human life was nothing. The death sentence against Menderes was a barbarism of a particularly heinous kind, as the English newspaper Guardian reported at the time, as Ascot told me. And in my opinion, it was precisely that consciousness against which General Gürsel and his officers had revolted that breathed in Turkey back in 1961. Western Kemalist Turkey at that time had fallen back with everything into the despotism of the Orient. The fact was that the autocrat, big landowner, lawyer, and prime minister of Turkey, Adnan Menderes, had been overthrown in May 1960 because he had gone against the new consciousness of modern Turkey, as it had been built by Kemal Atatürk, the father of modern Turkey. The small, nimble Menderes was thoroughly corrupt, endured various mistresses, and harassed the opposition to the death, while he showered the Muslim conservative peasantry with electoral gifts and thus undermined the Atatürk reforms, which ultimately was his downfall and broke his neck when he was hanged. Menderes had already early conspired to the Western Enlightenment. As the son of a landowner, modern farmer, and pupil of a U.S. college, he did not even know his own date of birth. It is also a fact that he reopened the mosques closed by Turkey's founder Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and courted the religious traditions of the backward farmers. And this he did, although he was not a believer and distant from any religion. Somehow he followed the reformer Atatürk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey and first president from 1923 to 1938, just after the First World War. Consequently, the modern republic had emerged from the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Kemal was actually a Greek and was born on the 19th of May 1881 in Thessaloniki, Greece, after which he died on the 10th of November 1938 in Istanbul, Turkey. Since 1934 it had the suffix Atatürk. Adnan Menderes became a member of the National Assembly in 1930 and enjoyed Atatürk's confidence to such an extent that the reformer even sent him into a sham opposition party whose foundation was traced back to Atatürk himself. Menderes himself, he told me during a conversation in his cell, found great favor with opposition speeches, and as he further said, he then dissolved the sham party and founded in 1945 with conservative politicians and bankers a real opposition movement, which he called Democratic Party. This party was his springboard, because in 1950 it won the majority, which then brought Adnan Menderes to power. With this, he saw the dream of his life come true, and the time had come to use his power to turn Turkey into a modern industrial state. He was obsessed and had factories, power stations, dams, and roads built in his madness. Menderes said of himself bragging in his madness, and he had actually fallen for a madness, as I myself noticed and experienced during the conversation with him. Atatürk is the founder of Turkey, but I am its builder. He was a man who was eager for the applause of his fellow men, and therefore could not live without the acclamation of others. In addition, he had become a slave to gigantomania, so he completely overlooked it and was unable to recognize that his ill-considered and megalomaniac actions had plunged Turkey and its people into debt and inflation. So he watched without understanding the whole thing that resulted from his madness. But this did not escape the opposition, which inevitably led to political anger. For the time being, however, Adnan Menderes, who was once an opposition figure himself, suppressed everything that was against him, including the press and the opposition, destroying everything necessary in his favor, including the secular foundations of the Ataturk state, in order to secure the electoral sympathies of the peasants. So it could not fail that soon the newly built mosques were built in masses and cast their deep shadows over Turkey, which became more and more restless. The result was a downright Muslim restoration, which threatened everything, which of course did not remain without consequences, because it came what had to come, namely that the intelligentsia and officers beat off against the autocrat Menderes. But even then, when he was deposed and imprisoned in the dungeon, Menderes remained a prisoner, a danger that consisted in the peasant masses coming at any moment to the aid of the overthrown mosque builder and triggering a civil war. So the only solution to the whole delicate and even vicious problem was to resort to the traditional Oriental measure of simply taking Adnan Menderes out of circulation and bringing him to the gallows. So he had to die, hanged and killed as the first head of government of a NATO state. The people of the Western world, all the military, politicians and other NATO officials, calmly acknowledged and supported the execution of their former allied Turkish partner, but howled at any other political assassination in China, Russia, Hungary, or Cuba, etc. And because all the events surrounding Adnan Menderes, his actions and his execution were completely unclear and opaque to the Turkish population, a strange conspiracy theory arose in Turkey, which ultimately turned into a superstition that the great liberator Adnan Menderes was not dead at all, but was riding through the country on a white horse at night to eagerly test the loyalty of his followers. Many Anatolian farmers whispered this to themselves, and some, it is to be assumed, still do so today. Superstitions and conspiracy theories are long-lived and persist for centuries and millennia, as the religious marriages, which are taken at face value by religious believers and sect believers and are asserted and presented as truth, prove in particular worldwide.
If you want to have further explanations from Asket or excerpts from conversations between you and her, then I can help you in this regard, because I have all of Asket's recordings.
Here and there that might be good, but I think that even without these reports we always have enough material to have good discussions. If I perhaps have a question in connection with ascetics, etc. again. Let us be surprised. Today I would like to talk again about the EU dictatorship, Angela Merkel, the refugee system, the murderess is, the USA as well as Russia, and climate change, because there are many thoughts going through my head, as well as about neonicotinoids, where everything is talked about again and again on television, but only idiotically stupid speeches are made by politicians and other responsible persons, as well as by naive moderators and presenters who think of themselves in their stupidity as great and clever. Particularly when I look at the political figures of both sexes and listen to their simple and grand words, they seem to me like childish contemporaries who are narrow-minded and addicted to power. And if
It is necessary to interrupt you in your speech, for which I apologize, but what you have just said I do not understand by what I mean the term Abderithite, which is unknown to me in the German language.
Excuse me. It was not my intention to embarrass you, but I would like to explain what Abderithite means and where the term comes from, namely from an old satirical but psychologically and sociologically constructed novel entitled Die Abderiten, written by a German author named Christoph Martin Wieland, who lived in 2 different centuries, because he was born in the 18th century and died in and in the 19th century. Abderiten is actually a term for fools who commit foolish acts, as they have been since time immemorial and still appear in Earthlings today. Abderites are also referred to by another term as simple and as shield citizens, and thus also as naively stupid people, whereby the original term Abderite, however, does not come from Old German but from Ancient Greek, namely in connection with the ancient city of Abdera. The whole thing with the Abderites, who are also called Shield citizens, is not connected with the German Shield citizens, whose history leads back to the place Schild, which is said to have existed in the Middle Ages in Germany, whose citizens were therefore called Shield citizens according to their city name. The whole thing is probably a legend, and probably has nothing to do with today's town of Schildau or Belgern-Schildau, a Saxon town in the district of Nord-Sachsen. The Shield citizens are said to have been strange people who, in principle, did everything wrong and wrong that they touched and did. It is even said to have been so that they understood and implemented everything that was said and explained to them exactly as it was said and explained to them. Of course, all this stupidity could not be concealed, so that it soon became known everywhere, which is why all over Germany there was laughter about the Shield citizens. And so it emerged from this legend, for it really is about such a legend, that even today a human being is called a Shield citizen if he misunderstands something, does something wrong, or acts wrongly.
I did not know that legend.
Now you know them, and if you investigate something, then you can certainly learn a lot more than I told you. But now I want to say a few words about what I started to talk about earlier. Earthlings do not want to know or understand that climate change accounts for about 75%, and that the large-scale destruction of nature and its flora, as well as the 1,000-fold extinction of fauna, human habitats and all forms of life are the sole consequences of the irresponsible machinations of the human overpopulation of Earth. This is because all the unscrupulous effects and catastrophically degenerated influences of the overpopulation of Earthlings with regard to nature, fauna, flora, and climate, carried out so profitably, caused irreparable destruction, and the resources of Earth were exploited with criminal means in such a way that already today there is hardly any means that nature, its fauna and flora as well as the climate, can normalize again. This also applies to forests, meadows and streams, rivers, streams, ponds, lakes and oceans, moorlands and natural swamps, etc., as well as to the atmosphere, which is slowly but surely destroyed by poisonous emissions, exhaust fumes from all kinds, and countless explosion engines of cars, trucks, ships, motorcycles, working machines, rockets, bombs, weapons, and many other motor vehicles, etc., again and again. However, there are questions from all sorts of people, as well as discussions on television and stupid proposals for solutions from politicians, especially with regard to the refugee flows from Syria and Africa. Real responsibility is not mentioned, neither by the EU dictators in Brussels nor by the German Chancellor Merkel, whereby she in particular stirs up the refugee fire by continuing on her crazy course and attracting countless other economic refugee tourists and real refugees to Germany and the EU dictatorship. If all her actions are considered carefully, then she is a traitor to her own country and people. For she is not only breaking EU laws, but she is also cheating the German people, because she wants to take revenge on them for what the Nazis did against the Jews in the last World War. Angela Merkel is treated as a Zionist. She is supposed to be such a Zionist, which would not be reprehensible if it were true. But as German Chancellor she is, in my opinion, an unbearable, self-opinionated false snake, and undermines the freedom of the German people to drive them into the clutches of the world domination-addicted USA, because she vehemently represents the interests of the USA and Israel in Germany, and in the EU dictatorship in a way no one else does. Merkel is an autocratically determining greedy for power, who lures and lets influx unlimited masses of wealthy or at least not poor economic refugee tourists to Germany and to the EU dictatorship countries, who heesh for horrendous prosperity and for a life in luxury, and who are also welcomed, received and supplied with money, accommodations, and all kinds of goods by all German and European false humanists with open arms. This in contrast to the fact that real refugees, who are persecuted in their home countries for political or religious reasons and threaten their lives and therefore inevitably flee their homeland or have to save their lives as effective war refugees, on the one hand only manage to flee to a neighboring country and a refugee camp there because they are poor and do not have financial means, as is the case with financially well-off economic refugee tourists. On the other hand, It is precisely such genuine refugees, if they manage to get to a safe country in any way at all at the risk of their lives and under inhuman strain, who are insulted by xenophobic and racial haters in the refugee countries and treated dirty or deported by the authorities instead of offering them legitimate asylum. But this happens explicitly because, on the one hand, xenophobic and racial haters are inhumane and stingy needic creatures who see only themselves and their own advantages, which they always try to exploit, which they unfortunately often succeed in doing, while they let others go hungry and hunt into sheer misery if they find a way to do so. On the other hand, these xenophobic and racial-hating lousy creatures are so primitive in their bean-straw stupidity and arrogance as well as in their self-delusion as even a wild primitive man who has never heard or experienced anything of civilization cannot be. And all these inhumane forms of behavior of xenophobes, racial and religious haters also contribute to the roaring, stupid, extreme fanaticism of racial madness, whereby those affected by it are of the idiotic, imbecilic belief that they belong to a better human race, as is the case, among other things, with various religious sects which believe themselves to be chosen by God and better men. But it is also the racial mad neo-Nazis, the mad racial haters of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the haters of people, society, religion, and the people, fascists, murderers, and hate extremists of all kinds, who have fallen into xenophobia, racial hatred and ethnic hatred, and who work openly or treacherously to discriminate against innocent people, to harass them psychologically or physically, to inflict material damage on them or even to murder them. But it is also the economic refugee tourists who, because of their very often impudent, indecent, demanding, and quarrelsome behavior, promote hatred against all refugees, as well as the fact that these false types of refugees are usually at least reasonably well off financially, and can pay their flight from their homeland to an industrialized country, etc., with horrendous sums of money. And in principle, Angela Merkel promotes exactly these economic refugee tourists, which does not remain hidden from the German people, which is why many are angry about it, rebel, and wish the refugees to the devil and to hell or behind the moon. The fact that racist elements can then come to the fore, new organizations can be brought into being, and foreign and racial hatred, propaganda can be carried out, and a lot of people can be brought on their side, which then proceeds with protest marches, racially hate-soaked speeches and roarings, as well as fisticuffs and destructions against people alien to the people. Real and false refugees, and beats them up and even murdered in the worst case. This only corresponds to an inevitable consequence. And in this day and age, when the enormous streams of refugees from economic refugee tourists and the much smaller number of genuine political, religious, and war-troubled refugees are coming to Europe, it is absolutely clear that Angela Merkel is to blame for the whole disaster in this respect, because she has let her trumpet sound for it. Effectively, the Chancellor is so consciously undercut in her alienated naivety and her delusion of power that she is unable to distinguish between genuine war refugees and economic refugee tourists. So she cannot recognize in her stupid way of thinking, feeling, and acting, and cannot understand that she has lured by her unreasonableness for the most part only economic refugee tourists to Europe and especially to Germany, Sweden, and into the EU dictatorship, who only for economic and prosperity reasons flee from their homeland, moreover are wealthy and provided with money with which they could live well in their homeland and could continue to do so. And that this megalomaniac and power-hungry woman has caused a tremendous refugee crisis, as she vehemently advocated the Iraq War in 2002 and ordered the deployment of the German Bundeswehr in the Afghanistan War. Nobody of the other EU dictatorship powers speaks of it, and the people are kept blind in this regard and do not know what really happened in this way, and that Angela Merkel as German Chancellor has pulled her power-mad strings. And it has also done this by letting its power play in various other areas and letting it continue to play, whereby, for example, Germany and the EU dictatorship support the Americans' demand that they be able to supply masses of weapons to the Assad oppositionals, who have been waging a terrible civil war in Syria for about 4 years, killing more than 200,000 people, mostly innocent inhabitants of villages and towns, such as women and children who basically wanted peace and neither war nor death. It does not matter that the civil warring opposition members of the Assad regime are fighting against the regular Assad army, because both parties murder people and destroy human dwellings and achievements equally and without distinction. The civil warring parties are terrorists, as are the regular army members and the killers of the IS or Islamist State. And what the USA afford with their arms deliveries to the insurgents in Syria is not better than what they did in Iraq, where even today neither peace nor calm have returned, after the US military destroyed the order in Iraq, abandoned it and hanged Saddam Hussein, whereby the terror militia or the Islamist State could gain a foothold, and since then can cause murderous disaster not only in Iraq itself, but also in Syria and in various other countries of Arabia and the world in general. And especially from these countries, but also from Eritrea and various states in Africa, in which the West has intervened militarily or is still doing so, or where colonies have been established by European states, or where military troops have done their mischief, the war refugees and economic refugee tourists come from. The fact is that the mass flight of all the people from Africa, the Arab countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Asia, as well as all the crises in Europe, is the fault of the EU dictatorship politicians, and above all of Chancellor Merkel, in addition to the fault of the Americans and NATO, who interfere everywhere, wage wars, and thereby create war refugees. All of them are a hypocritical pack of power-hungry, dictatorially overriding all humanity and human rights, hypocritically lying about charity and not even having a guilty conscience. That Merkel, as well as her EU dictators, who are unconditionally in bondage to her, still allow the USA to conduct their dirty and despicable world police tricks, their Secret Service intrigues, as well as their wars in various countries all over the world, from Germany, which they practically annexed after the last World War, and from where they control their war crimes, etc. in Europe. Arabia and Asia, which the German population and the world in general apparently but do not notice. That is the hammer. The whole thing directed against the German people in this respect is probably the most evil and sneaky thing imaginable, which cannot be surpassed by secret intrigues and dirty machinations against Germany and its people. The evil that the USA and the EU dictatorship are doing against Russia, such as sanctions and slander, is also something that clearly and unambiguously expresses the sanctioners' dirty attitude to power and their unscrupulous willingness to use violence, even to the point of weapons conflicts and even war. So the US and EU powers, and above all Angela Merkel, should not be surprised if Russia, in resistance to the idiotic offensive sanction machinations, lies, slander, and peace-threatening as well as openly hostile machinations, counteracts and goes its own way, which are contrary to peaceful coexistence. Precisely because the USA, the EU dictatorship, and their mother of the refugees are doing everything they can to consciously promote the whole thing in this way and to conjure up the worst of all evil. And with the term conjure, I'm also with neonicotinoids. If you can say something about what they actually are and how they affect insects, vertebrates in general, and of course man because he is also a vertebrate and therefore susceptible to these and other poisons?
I can, but first of all I want to say that what you have said is correct in every respect in relation to all the facts that have been mentioned. Then the neonicotinoids. These are the most dangerous and insidious toxic substances ever created by irresponsible Iraqi researchers and released into nature by equally irresponsible farmers, vegetable growers, and private users.
In the case of Earthlings, profit in any form comes before responsibility. The exercise of responsibility does not come about by disregarding it and ignoring the future.
Then here's what I want to say about neonicotinoids. These are mainly used as seed dressings and for foliar and soil treatment, where they correspond to a group of highly effective insecticides, which all correspond to synthetically produced toxic substances and are fatal to all living beings depending on the amount, including humans. The best-known 3 neonicotinoids are called clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam. As far as insects are concerned, the toxic substances basically act on their nerve cells, and much more strongly than on the nerves of vertebrates, as you say, which also includes humans, even if not as animals. The neonicotinoids bind to the nicotine acetylcholine receptor of nerve cells and thus interfere with the transmission of nerve stimuli. The neonicotinoids penetrating into the soil and storing in the soil for a long time act as contact or feeding poisons in insects and vertebrates. How the toxic substances are absorbed via the plant roots and transported into the leaves, fruits, and rods, which are then eaten by insects and vertebrates, and how they are of course also eaten by humans, who are thus inevitably poisoned just as much as insects and vertebrates. Even tiny amounts in the nanoscale already form factors in humans which cause suffering in, on, and with them, which do not act aggressively at first and are not recognized as such, but which become more and more aggressive over time and ultimately increasingly detrimental to health, whereby, as a rule, the physicians do not recognize the origin and true cause of the disease, which ultimately leads to death for the sick patient. Unfortunately, the manufacturers and users of neonicotinoids, on the one hand, do not recognize this fact with regard to humans, but on the other hand, research is not carried out in a decisive way that the truth could be found out. And this happens simply because the manufacturing companies are only interested in profit, but not in human health, as is the case with the users of neonicotinoids. In this case, it is agriculture and horticulture in particular that are ultimately the most profit-oriented, using toxic substances without hesitation and poisoning everything. They are therefore the main culprits, because if they did not buy the toxins and did not use them, then the manufacturers of the toxins and thus also of the neonicotinoids would not be able to exist. And what I have to say further is this. Plants treated with neonicotinoids are thus protected from both biting and sucking insects. But even after harvesting, subsequent plants also absorb the toxic substances because these remain in the soil for a long time and degrade only very slowly through their absorption by plants and seepage into the groundwater. The neonicotinoids are mainly used as seed dressings, but they are also sprayed and applied directly to plants, as I said before, but they are also used as granules or irrigation water additives, which mainly cause soil contamination with the neonicotinoids, which, as I also mentioned earlier, are only degraded very slowly in the soil and never completely in the plants themselves. As a result, plants whose leaves, stems, stalks, or fruits always contain more or less toxic substances, even in relation to other toxins not belonging to the neonicotinoids, whose effects over time, when eaten by vertebrates, eaten by humans, or absorbed through the pores of the skin, cause health problems of various species. Pathological manifestations, which can lead to aggression, allergies, age-related problems, asthma, eye inflammation, loss of consciousness, depression, mental and emotional disturbances, and concentration disorders belong to the repertoire of unavoidable consequences. Memory loss, taste disorders, ulcers, skin rashes, as well as skin irritations. Skin discoloration, brain damage, headaches, cancer, orientation disorders, vision problems, pregnancy and birth defects, acute forgetfulness, and even death are ultimately inevitable. This applies to humans, all vertebrates, and all other animals if they are contaminated with neonicotinoids in any form, whereby even quantities in the nano-weight range are lethal for insects but already harmful for larger organisms and humans. Neonicotinoids have an effect not only on life forms such as insects, vertebrates, and humans, but on all life forms in general, which is denied by earthly researchers, scientists, and responsible persons. Neonicotinoids accumulate not only in all forms of life, but also in all foods produced from contaminated plants and fruits. And if, even after a long period of harvest, potatoes or other tuberous plants are planted in soil impregnated with neonicotinoids, for example, they all absorb the toxic substances and transport them into the leaves, stems, stalks, and fruits, as is the case with cabbage, lettuce, and all kinds of head and leaf vegetables, as well as berries and tomatoes. etc. in insects? As already mentioned, the acetylcholine substance group acts at the nicotine acetylcholine receptor of the nerve cells, whereby no degradation by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase takes place. So the receptor is permanently stimulated, which leads to disturbances of the chemical signal transmission. The permanent stimulus caused by this leads to cramps and ultimately to the death of insects. As can also be the case with vertebrates and humans, if long enough minute amounts of toxic substances accumulate in the body. The lethal dose of ingested neonicotinoids, especially imidacloprid and clothianidin, is, for example, in honeybees in a very low nanogram range, while the lethal amount increases depending on the way of life. But already in small amounts causes health weak to severe damage, which causes years of suffering of all kinds, which ultimately lead to death, even in humans and all vertebrates. The problem here is that in humans and vertebrates, such minute poisonings are very difficult to detect due to the extraordinarily small amounts of active substances in the order of a few nanograms per 100 grams body weight, as is the case with various insects, such as bees, for example, in which the neonicotinoids have caused mass mortality.
Thank you, and if you can spare some time, then I have some private things to discuss with you.
Unfortunately, this is no longer possible, dear friend, because for today I have to end our conversation and leave, but I will come back late next Wednesday night to discuss your questions with you. Unfortunately, time has moved on, which is why I have to go. Goodbye, Edward, and be ready Wednesday night. Goodbye.